Now that we've got our routes, controllers and views set up for our create functionality, we'll go ahead and actually fill in this method now. But obviously the first thing we need to do is change the fact that we don't actually have any fields for a user to input. Again, we're keeping this very, very basic, but we're going to need the fields in here to be able to actually submit the data. So let's go ahead and just start to create these fields. I'm going to create a div here with the class of field, which doesn't have any styles associated with it, but could do in your application. It depends on how you're designing everything. And just one thing to mention before we continue. Within Laravel, there are actually helpers to generate form fields, the actual form action you see up here, and you'll see a lot of people do this. They'll use like form start, and they'll use helpers to generate input fields. I personally prefer actually writing the markup myself rather than using or utilizing Laravel's functionalities to build the markup for me. I just like having the control. So again, if you look at other resources, you'll find that people are generating this using Laravel's helpers, but it's just, again, personal preference. I like to build everything in this sense from scratch. So that's it. So let's carry on and actually build what fields we need. So the fields that we need are very simple: email, username, password, and password again. And these are all going to be fully validated. So the first is the input field, and that's going to be a type of text. The name of this is going to be email. And then for now, I think we can leave, we'll leave it as it is for now. And we'll just duplicate this down. So this is going to be username. Name, username. This is going to be password. It's going to be a type of password, and the name is going to be password. Let's duplicate this password field down, and we'll type in password again, and then this is going to be password again. Okay, so now that we've got our fields, let's take a look at what this looks like. Perfect. So we've got our field data. What we'll now do is we'll hop over to our controller to actually build the functionality, and we'll look at sending errors back to this view and redirect the user if there are any problems, and then we'll look at how we might output this validation. So what we're now going to focus on is Laravel's validation class, which allows us to validate things, all of the input that we want, based on a variety of settings. And this is a really, really easy way to validate, and it certainly takes a load off development. So the first thing that I'm going to do within this this method is I'm going to create a variable called validator, and this is going to be validator make. Now we have two parameters to pass through here: the input of the application, or the input that we expect to validate, and then the rules associated with it. So input all will basically give us all of the input that we have. So we can test this out by doing a print r on input all. So let's take a look at what happens here. So create account, and we can see here that this has returned an array. It's got the token in there, as we saw: email, username, password, and password again. So it's just a really easy way to access some data in post get data. So we have a validator. We want to go ahead and now pass through an array. So I'm just pulling this down onto new lines just so it looks a little bit easier. But of course, it's up to you how you sort of indent and structure this. But effectively, all these are key value pairs where we supply the validation rule in here. So on one line, this would look like the following, just in case it doesn't make sense. It would look like this. So this is the first parameter here, and this is the second parameter. But what I like to do is just pull it down, just so I can do multiple lines and make them look nice. So we have email, we have username, we have password, and we have password again. So that's it. We now can define the rules of our input. So with email, this is required. Username, that's required also. Password is obviously required, and the password again is required. So we just supply required for all of them. Now if we want to do multiple rules, we can go ahead and separate these using the pipe symbol. And what this will do is it will just allow multiple rules to be for an individual sort of form field. So I do a pipe symbol here, and I'm going to say max 50. And the reason I'm doing that is within my database, I supplied, let's just remove that record from earlier. I supplied the email with a varchar of 50, the data type. So I would expect to require a maximum of 50. And Laravel will alert a user if their email address has gone over 50 characters. So I'm going to choose another pipe now, and I'm going to specify that I want this to be an email field. And I'm also going to do something now that's a little bit more unique. And that is, well, not unique, it's a bit different, and it works a bit different. I'm going to supply the unique property here, if you like, and I'm going to choose the table that I want this to be unique from. Now, all this is going to do is it's going to pick up this name of this field, so email, and with unique users, it's going to look inside the users table, and it's going to alert the user if their email matches one that currently exists in the database. So this will look into the users table. It will say, is there a user with an email of alex@phpacademy.org? Yes, so the validation will fail. That's all we do in that sense. So with the username, we have a similar deal, max of 20 characters, and we're going to say a minimum of 3 characters. We could in fact do this with the email, but because we're validating it to a unique email, the character A, for example, wouldn't be a unique email. So we have a minimum of 3, and we're also going to define that this is going to be unique within the users table. So we definitely want this to be unique. We will again alert, this will send an alert back to the user if the username that they've chosen is unavailable. So if I register with Alex and someone else tries to register with Alex, this will look it up in the users table and let them know. The password is going to be a minimum of 6, that's all. And the password again is going to be the same. So much like unique, we have a colon to separate the property and the value as password. So this field must match this field, and that's all that means, so same as password. So underneath the validator variable that we've created, we've now actually validated all of the fields within all of the input, and we can now check if it's failed or not. So we can do basically a simple if statement here, and we want to say validator fails. So if validator fails, I'm going to die failed, else die success, and that just allows me to test if this is all working. So let's go ahead and hit this and click create an account. Failed. That's because nothing's been filled in, so all of these are now required. If I go ahead and fill these in now, this is all correct. There's no other users in the database table. We've deleted the example record from earlier. The email is valid. The username is valid. It's above 3 characters. It's below the minimum, the maximum of 20. The passwords match. That's just password. Create account. Success. So that's now succeeded and that's worked. But obviously this is useless. We want to actually be able to say to a user, sorry, you know, this failed, and otherwise we want to create account. So let's focus on what happens when the validation fails. Well, we want to return, this time we're not going to return a view, we're going to return a redirect to a route, and that route is going to be account create. So remember the short name that we defined in routes for account create. So just the account create page. This will redirect us back to the form effectively. And what we then want to do is say with errors, and then we want to pass in the validator. And what that will do is it will take all of the errors from the validator and it will pass it to this route, or to this page, sorry. We also want to redirect with input, and this will allow us to access the input that's already been sent to that controller, and then or sent with the request, sorry, and then that will allow us to implement the old input back into the field. So, for example, if you're filling out a long long form, and only one field was wrong, you wouldn't want all your input to vanish. We want to put the input back into the form, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead over to our create template, or our view, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just output a variable, or print R on a variable, and that is errors. So I'm going to stick that in pre-formatted tags, and obviously it's a blade template, so I can just output it like that. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and take a look at what happens. When I hit enter, here it says we've got an Illuminate support message bag object. So when I go ahead and hit create account, you can see that this fills up with all of the errors that we see. The email field is required, the username field is required, and if I type in a dodgy email address, it says the email format is invalid. So for each request, this is then passing back this sort of message object with errors in it. But we want to sort of not output this like that, because that's not very user friendly. We want to go ahead and output this after the field, so a user can actually see that this error has occurred. They can rectify their mistakes and carry on. So we create a little if statement down here with an end if, and within here we say if errors has, and we specify the name of the field that we want to check if it has any errors in. That's email. We then want to output errors first, and this will just be the first error that occurs. So we're just going to give the user the errors sort of as they come, and then they'll have to just keep rectifying them. The problems, you could loop through them, but in this case it doesn't really matter too much. And then that will just output it. Simple as that. So when I go ahead and refresh and click create an account, the email field is required. When I enter a correct email, we get no errors. So let's go ahead and just look at now the fact that I may, for example, go ahead and fill out this entire form correctly. Click create account. All of my field input vanishes, so all of this is gone. I'm going to just have to go through and enter it again, which is a real pain. What I now want to do is I want to define a value here, so like this, with a string in here, a value in here, if the old input exists. So I'm going to do a ternary operator, also known as an inline if statement, to check if the old input is available. If it is, I'm going to create a value attribute with the old email value. So in here, I'm going to say input old email, and the way that we get this is through this method here, this with input method. So that's how we get access to this. So if that is the case, what do we want to do? Well, we want to put a space here, because I've sort of coded this up here, and we're going to say value equals something, and that something value we're going to concatenate on input. Let's pull this over a little bit. Input old email. Otherwise nothing. So let's just run through this in case it looks a bit complicated. We'll be doing this on all of our views with fields, form fields. So we check if the input old is available. If it is, we create a value attribute. With a we concatenate on the input old value. Otherwise, we just output an empty string. Now, there is one more consideration here, and that's just to escape the output using the E function that's available in Laravel. That will just escape the output, so we don't have any sort of script tags or anything interfere. So we'll be doing that with all output as well, just as a security measure for XSS attacks and things like that. So let's go ahead now and just fill out my email address wrong, and go ahead and fill out all my other information correctly. We'll now see that if we inspect this, we have no value attribute here. There's no value attribute. When I click create an account, that's redirecting me back with the error, and it's kept the value. So we can now see that this value has output the old input value that we had in there before we submitted the form. So we're going to quickly go through and we're going to apply this to each one of the form fields. So we're just going to do this for username. We're going to say if errors has username, output the first error. We're going to do the same for password. If errors has password, errors first password. The same with password again. So if errors has password again, errors first password again. And we'll also do exactly the same as this with the ternary operator to output the value attribute when it's available, but we're only going to do this with the username. We're not going to do this with the password because we don't want to store or pass back password information and plonk it into the form. So let's take a look at how this is sort of working out now. Let's click create an account, so we get all of these errors output now. The email field is required, the username field is required, blah blah blah. Let's go ahead and fill this out incorrectly. So there we go, we get the email format is invalid, so I correct my email address, I correct my password. Let's just say I'm going to type in a completely different password in this field, create an account. The password again must match, the password again and password must match. So I type in the correct two passwords and it works. There we are. So we're also going to quickly now go ahead and create a cheeky test account just to check the unique functionality. So we've got an email of alex@phpacademy.org and a username of Alex. Let's go ahead and choose both of these. So both of these are already taken. Let's go ahead and enter a password twice, create an account. The email has already been taken and the username has already been taken. So we know that these are now looking up into the database and checking whether or not this information already exists or not. And just as a side point as well, you may notice that when I click create an account, this is actually quite slow to request, and that's because it's doing a database lookup. Now by default within your config, so within your database config, if we just open that, you'll notice that this has a host of localhost. I'm going to go ahead and change that to 1.7.0.0.1 just so the request is a little bit quicker. So just a little tip there, if you are working locally, you can see now how much quicker that request is. So we've got all of our validation working. Now we need to go ahead and actually create the user's account. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's head over to our account controller. This is here where we're going to go ahead and create the actual account data, and this is surprisingly easy. So we're not going to send the validation email just yet. We'll save that for the next part. But what we're now going to do is we're going to gather the variables that we want to insert into the database. So email equals input get. Now remember, we've already seen input all and input old, but input get will get by a specific field. So in this case it's email. We'll duplicate that down. That's going to be username, input get username, and lastly password, input get password, and we'll just indent them over just so they're a little bit easier to read. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and generate an activation code. So we want to create a random string with say 60 characters long that we're going to place into our database. So the activation code, so we'll create another variable called code, and that is going to be strRandom. So it's a function that's available in Laravel, and we're going to basically define what length we want this to be. So that's going to be able to, well, we're going to be able to place that into this part of our database. And the reason that we do that is that when we send the email to ask the user to validate their account, we need a specific way for us to be able to identify a user by their by the link that's sent to them. We could do it by their username, but then anyone would be able to access anyone's validate anyone's account. So let's go ahead and do the important bit and actually get this user input into the database, and we'll focus on the sending of emails and stuff later. So I'm going to create a variable called create, and this is going to be user. So we're now accessing the user model as we saw earlier. So let's take a look at under models user. So we're now accessing this user model, and we're going to go ahead and actually create. So we're going to use a static create method, and this is available in Eloquent, remember. So you won't see this method defined here. It's not defined in here at all. It's part of Eloquent. So that's why we don't see this method within our actual user model. It's been inherited. So what we now do is just pass an array in, fairly straightforward, key value pairs of the data that we want to insert into our database table. In this case, it's email is email, and username is username. Remember, this data is coming from what we defined up here. We then have password. Now password's a little bit different because what we don't want to do is just do this. That's silly. That's gonna store a plain text version of our password, which will be terrible. So we're going to say hash make and enclose that password in there. What this will do is it will generate for us a 60-character hash, which we'll then be able to store in our database table, and we'll use Laravel's authentication functionality to check that this password is correct later on. So that will just be a hashed value within the table. So code is going to be code. Remember the activation code. We'll look at that in the next part of the series. And active is going to be 0. So that's how we create a user account. But there is one small thing that we've forgotten to do. Inside of the user model, we actually need to define which fields of our database table, so here, are actually fillable. So we need to define which fields we can actually insert data into. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and define these. So inside of here, we'll go ahead and create a protected property called fillable, and that's going to be an array that's going to contain all of the values that we can fill. And in this case, it's going to be the email address, the username, the password again. The password temp, which we've already created in our database table, but we'll look at that functionality later. Code and active. So it's basically just the fields that we need to allow Eloquent to actually insert for us. So now that we've done that, all of these will work. So what do we want to do now? Well, this is going to work if we actually submit our form. It will work as long as everything validates okay. But what we actually want to do is create an if statement just to check if create was success. So if this user was created, I mean, we can even call this user, to be honest. It might make a little bit more sense. But as long as that user is now created, we can go ahead and return redirect route to home. And we want to go ahead and send a little message, and we haven't built this functionality, but I'll go ahead and define it here. So I'm going to say with global, your account has been created. We have sent you an email to activate your account. Now, we haven't actually sent the user an email to activate their account. We'll be doing that here, so I'll just write send email to set me a reminder, but what we're doing is we're returning back to the home route, so basically the home page of our application. Remember, we defined home here, and that is basically just the root of our application, and we're now saying with global string. So you're probably wondering what on earth this does. What this is going to do is it's going to send along with it a variable, and global is going to be our global message area on our template that allows us to output any information passing it along to a template. And we'll see how this works in just a moment. So let's go ahead and build in this functionality, this global sort of functionality. To do that, we'll head over to our main.blade layout. We're going to go ahead and create an if statement here. And we're going to say if session has global, so remember we passed with global, we're then going to output a paragraph. This could be a div, it could be a container. The point is this is defined on the template, so this will be accessible for every single page on our application that uses this template. And we're going to say session get global. So what this is now going to do is in our account control, it's going to redirect us to home. This if statement here will check if global exists, which it will do because we've passed global to this this controller, this route, and then it will output the value of that. So this will be passed as a session essentially. So what we're now going to do is we're going to go ahead and fill in our form. We already know the validation works, so we're not going to check that, and we'll then check whether to see whether or not the data has been inserted into our table. So let's go ahead and enter some sensible information. click create account. And there we are, we're returned to the home page and we can see your account has been created. We've sent an email to activate your account. Now, the reason that we've done this and not sort of passed it and picked up in any other way is when I go ahead and refresh the page now, you'll see that will disappear because it's what we call session flashing. It will insert that piece of data, that string message into a session, and it will then delete the session. So the next time we refresh, that message will no longer be available, because what you don't want is to be passing messages sort of through the, through here saying account created and stuff like that, which is, another solution to that problem. But yeah, basically all we've done now is we've actually created an account, or have we? Let's check our database, and yes, we have. So the email is there, the username is there, the hashed password is there, the code is there that we're later going to use to actually send an email and validate our account, and active is set to 0. So now that that's done, we're going to go ahead in the next part and actually send an email to be able to actually activate our account.